All right, we're ready to roll. Jay, life reading, go ahead.
So, a committee of pastors are deciding what to do concerning a pastor named Trombo. This is kind of located in the South Pacific Islands, where the custom is that when a wife does wrong, the husband can beat her for it. Pastor Trombo has beaten his wife for leaving their daughter unattended while she went out shopping for a dress. The child was found by Pastor Trombo when he got home. She was surrounded by rat poison that she'd gotten into and scattered around and played with. And so Pastor Trombo took her to the hospital, had her stomach pumped just to kind of make sure. But this is actually one of several times that his wife has done this, left her kid unattended. And so Pastor Trombo has been scolding her every time that she's done it. However, this time it was kind of more serious to the point where, because of what had happened, that he actually beat her for it. His wife is named Payam, and she went to a missionary couple after it happened that kind of lives near them, and she told them about it. I believe the relationship is that she worked for them for several months, so they're good friends. The husband of the missionary couple, Carl Hansen, he talked to Trombo about it, kind of went to him and tried to reason with him about it. But Trombo kind of shrugged it off and said it was their custom, that it's just something that their people do and that it's not bad. Carl Hansen then went to the committee and kind of reported everything to them. And the committee was kind of struggling to come up with a decision because Pastor Trombo was actually very successful in his ministry. His church was flourishing and had lots of people coming. And so it was, along with that, there were also older members there, older people that kind of believed that he did the right thing, that, the wife was kind of getting, what she was asking for. However, there was also people that grew up in the church that weren't quite as old, and they weren't really used to the custom, or at least they didn't agree with it. And they don't seem entirely 100% on it, but they kind of feel like Pastor Trombo may have sinned. And then there's also new converts, people that have kind of come in and joined the church, but they're just kind of confused about the whole situation, and they don't really know how to process it all. So for the characters, there's Pastor Trombo. He's the pastor of a flourishing church, and he's right now under scrutiny for beating his wife. Then there's Payam, which is the wife of Trombo. There's Carl Hansen. He's a missionary to the area, him and his wife. The committee is actually a pastor's disciplinary committee. I don't think it said where they're from. I think they might just be pastors in the area that kind of came together. And they're the ones kind of making a decision on this case. The older people, they agree with what Pastor Trombo did, kind of growing up in that culture. And then the members that grew up in the church, they disagree with what Pastor Trombo did. And then the new converts obviously are confused by the situation. So the issues that I sort of saw within this study or a case was that Pastor Trombo has beaten his wife, but more so than that, it's causing strife between people of his church. His actions are leading to disunity. And also the disciplinary committee have to make a decision that may cause the presently flourishing church that's growing to be hindered or destroyed by it. So they're kind of well, whatever decision we make, it's going to cause issues. So kind of the alternatives that I see is that Pastor Trombo gets exhorted to repent, reconcile with his wife, perhaps even make a statement to his church about it, lay down some kind of rules and guidelines about the custom. And kind of my support for that, Colossians 3:19, which says, "Husbands, love your wives, and do not be embittered against them." Ephesians 5:25, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her." Ephesians 5:28-29, "So husbands ought to also love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ loves the church." And then finally, 1 Peter 3:7, "You husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered." The other alternative is that Pastor Trumbo is vindicated for his actions and is found right, and I guess he's kind of allowed to get away with beating his wife. And the only real biblical verses I could find that even vaguely support this is in Proverbs. That's Proverbs 12:4. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who shames him is like rottenness in his bones. And then Proverbs 21:19 is better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and vexing woman. So that's kind of, yeah, so those verses didn't really support it too well, but those are the only ones I could find that really lay out any negativity for a wife like that. So in my opinion, I kind of view this as definitely a cultural issue that would be hard to make an answer to, but I feel like definitely he shouldn't be allowed to beat his wife. I don't think that's right. I think there's a plethora of verses. I mean, those are just 5 that I picked out from the New Testament, but there's plenty of verses that talk about the value of the wife and how much love you're supposed to show towards your wife. And so to me, it kind of doesn't feel right for him to just physically beat her or something like that. But despite all the issues that might come up with the church, whether there might be some sort of contention or backlash because of it, I still don't think it's right to just allow him to kind of get away with it, because that would basically mean that he's morally justified in doing it. So, yeah.
Good, let's talk about it.
I would also add that we see like parents have a responsibility to like biblically discipline their children. We don't see that in the responsibilities given to husbands to their wives. Like husbands are continuously told to love their wives, and then wives are given the command to submit themselves. Like the husband also isn't commanded to force your wife into submission. Like it's the wife's responsibility to submit herself to her husband. So yeah, I would agree with you.
Amy, can I just ask you a question? Because children are also exhorted to submit to their parents.
The parents are also given like biblical discipline authorities and responsibilities.
So what you're saying is there's never an exhortation to a husband to exercise this type of discipline on his wife?
Not that I'm aware of.
Me neither. What else?
Just for the sake of argument. I can't see how, obviously this would go to heart motive, but a lot of the verses that you used were talking about or to against the beating of his wife were the passages that command husbands to love their wives. And obviously it doesn't discuss his, like, what he was thinking with as much. But I don't think you can argue that beating his wife in this manner was necessarily unloving, because there is a responsibility for the husband to lead his wife. This was better in my head before I started speaking it. But if he could genuinely be, like it talked about where he had scolded her, he had tried to talk to her about her behavior and she just wasn't listening. And so he could be genuinely seeking to show her that her actions have consequences, and by leaving her daughter unattended, she is risking the life of their child. And his words were not showing that. So in a loving manner, he could be, this is wrong, I need you to listen to me, kind of aspect of beating. Just for sake of argument.
I feel like Amy's argument already defeats that right away.
Yeah.
Just because, like you said, children are submit to their parents, and there's disciplinary actions to be taken into account for children, but it doesn't say anything about disciplinary action for the wife. So if I get what you're saying, that's a great argument for a culture purpose, because if he was doing it out of love in like a disciplinary way, but like Amy said, there's no biblical text to support it though.
Do you think that there's a way to view a person as an adult? Or no, I said it backwards. Do you think it's possible to discipline somebody without having any anger in your heart and still view that person as an adult? Because if it's a child and you're disciplining them, obviously you're like, well, I'm the one that's raising them and stuff like that. So I'm doing this to like teach them.
Peer discipline, you think that sort of thing? Whether
Yeah.
it equals or?
But like if it's like an adult, you're married to the person, you're like partners in it. Do you think that there's a way for someone to do it in an actually loving way? Do you think that's impossible? And it can only be
To
anger?
discipline a child in a loving way, or
No,
to
an
discipline
adult.
someone and like still think of me as an adult? But I
Yeah.
would think of like my RAs give me violations, and I think they still think of me as adult, but they are still the authority over me.
Or like,
Well,
or like the police give it like
It's giving violations unbiblical.
No, but it's discipline.
yeah, or like the police giving you a ticket for speeding.
Yeah.
Well, I guess
like
it's-
Going to jail.
There are
I
still
guess
disciplinary
it's
actions.
physical violence.
Mhm.
Okay.
Physical violence, I feel, has a lot more emotion
Yes,
to it.
I agree.
And
I saw a video clip
There's more discipline besides physical.
I watched a video clip of in India of police riding around on motorcycles and whipping people that were not wearing masks. They had a mask mandate, and if they weren't wearing, and actually I watched them, they're just like whips using a horse, and or sticks. I think maybe they were sticks, whips or sticks, but they're beating people, and the people are just because they're not wearing masks, and they're adults riding motorcycles. And it was considered totally legitimate in the Indian culture for a policeman to do that.
I mean, think of the electric chair, other things like for more things like murder, like more drastic things. But like, so authority sometimes.
Well, would you say that principle applies across from a government body, like obviously being given the ability to kill, like with the sword, and a body which is, marriage, in terms of that same authority?
In other words, would a husband have a right to subject his wife to capital punishment? Really, that's what you're asking.
Yeah, basically.
Obviously,
Probably not.
we would all say that God never invested that in a man. He invested in civil authority. Never invested in.
I have a question. Is wife beating something that was prevalent in like Jewish culture? Like ancient Jewish culture?
If it was, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Did it happen? I'm sure it did.
Yeah, it was, I think, with slaves. I found a verse that said, like, if you beat a slave and it dies, then the sin is on you. But if you beat a slave and it lives for a few days, at least, then the sin is not on you.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
Because it's your property.
It's really, yeah. We won't open that can of worms.
Yeah. I found that and I was like, man, that's another thing.
What's the passage that talks about a husband or a pastor who is unable to lead his family, is unable to lead the church?
First Timothy 3.
This pastor.
Qualifications of pastor. Hey, can I ask you a question? In your first alternative, he's exhorted to repent and reconcile with his wife. Are you implying by that in so doing, he retains his pastorate, or are you also introducing the possibility he might even be removed as a pastor? You didn't state that either way, but would that kind of like, is there a third alternative possibly floating around there?
To me, I feel like because it is a custom of the people, and culturally, a lot of them don't feel like it's wrong. I feel like there should be a little bit more grace given concerning their context. And obviously, here in America, if a pastor did that, I'd be like, you're out. Like, you're gone. You're done. But I feel like in a culture like that, where it's literally been embedded in their culture for so many years, like just the fact that they're able to get somebody to agree that they were in the wrong all that time, I think would be a blessing. So I feel like for Pastor Trombo, I feel like if he's willing to repent about it, reconcile with his wife, change his ways, and I have no issue with him being my pastor. But
Can I ask you guys a question then related to that before we move on? Why is it in our culture that if a pastor, yells at his wife in public, he may feel like, oh man, I'm sorry, but we're not going to remove him. He loses his cool with her. But if he were to slap her across the face in public, the attitude of the church might be totally different. Why do we draw that line between, what is verbal, non-physical, and what is physical? Because that seems to be, I don't think this would even be an issue if he just yelled at his wife, right? Raised his voice. Why is it, what makes that happen? The difference between the non-verbal, the non-physical and the physical action taken. That's the dynamic we're dealing with here.
I think a lot of it goes to that last verse that Jade mentioned in his first section with the viewing your wife as the weaker vessel, where in general, men are physically stronger than women. And this physical strength makes the women more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that aspect, but then also in our culture, I think it is seen as degrading for someone to be beaten
Mm-hmm.
like that. And there's very much this physical equality that our culture promotes. And when a husband beats his wife, this equality is minimized, and it is often seen as, or it is often pointless violence, or seen as pointless violence.
Good.
More like a comment. Something from I guess, like firsthand experience, not like me, but like someone in my life, like that is, you could say, verbally abused or like whatever. Like, I don't know if I would say how I would like rate it as the same or not the same as like physical abuse, but definitely it's probably, coming from my experience, probably just as bad, like being quote unquote verbally abused or like controlled, like as being physically abused. It's obviously a different thing, but like, because it messes with you mentally, and like it's just very like degrading thing. So I feel like, almost like you said, like a pastor, if he's gonna like if he verbally abuses his wife, I almost would like, and obviously like that's just my thinking. Like I would almost put it at the same level as if he slapped his wife. Like,
I think there's a difference though between lashing out and regular abuse, where I think everyone has a tendency to lash out verbally,
yeah,
just because
but like
of our sin nature.
consistent
Yeah,
abuse over time of either verbally or physically, a consistent over time.
Right.
Like,
I would agree. If someone is verbally abusing his wife, he should not be a pastor.
So I will say that probably the one thing that makes it a bit of a hard issue, even in the slightest, I guess, is the fact that his wife is also in sin.
yeah,
Because
I think.
she's like literally neglecting her kid like several times.
Mm-hmm.
And to Pastor Trombo's credit, despite the fact that he just beat his wife, he did talk to her about it several times, like over and over and over again.
So this gets really interesting because her neglect of her daughter could be interpreted as a form of child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, she literally
nowadays,
had like rat poison like around her.
Mm-hmm. So if abuse is the key word here, this gets really interesting, doesn't it? Mm.
Can I add something to our last topic before we move on to that though? Like just like looking through 1 Timothy 3, like even if you wouldn't qualify I would agree, like people lash out and people have anger, and I wouldn't automatically label that as abuse if someone's like having a moment. But even if it's like, if it is a consistent thing of just lashing out, and maybe he's not even like degrading her, maybe he's not like like, verbally assaulting her necessarily, but if he has a consistent tendency to lash out and to lose his temper, like qualifications for pastor, like they must be sober-minded, they must be violent, or not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. Like, I feel like in a different sense, if he is continuously losing his temper to a fact that people have noticed it and he's not repentant of it, and it's something that he's like, well, she deserves it. Like if he's continuously losing his temper, then I think that would disqualify him from pastor.
Now, Amy, I would ask in this case, in his mind, is he losing his temper or is he exercising discipline? Because is he being violent or is he being responsible in his discipline? I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying, even in his culture, would his people view him as, he's a madman, he lost his mind, or are they viewing this as a form of discipline, which may not have anything to do with, in their minds, with abuse or losing your cool or anything like that? That's part of the tension we're dealing with here.
I think that would go back to how he responds to biblical truth.
How he responds to what?
To biblical truth and how that affects him. Yeah, sorry. Now we can go back to the other topic.
Dr. Mark, do you think that, like, before he beat her, do you think that he was doing as 1 Timothy 3 says, and managing his household well?
We don't have enough context to know. That's like so many case studies, we kind of jump in right here. But I do think your question is valid, because what he does here, could be tempered positively or negatively based on his testimony as a family man prior to this. But we just don't have any info.
Because to me, it's like, it really hinges on like just how his behavior is and what he's consistent in. Because if he's like naturally just like a loving father and he takes care of his family and he's checking all the boxes, and maybe that his wife just has really, because I think he even said in the case study that like some of what she was doing was out of spite.
That's true.
She was doing it inherently to actually get him angry, like to upset him.
I think, though, you could make the argument that that's more based off of Genesis, where part of the curse of sin is that a woman will desire to be her husband. And so, or take that leadership role, where a lot of women, all women, struggle with submission to their husbands. And she, again, I'm not saying this is for sure, but you could make the argument that her lashing out in spite could be she does not want him to exercise his husbandly role as leader of their home. But again, you can also make the argument where he has not been a good husband and she's lashing out because of that.
Yeah. So do you think like because of this incident that doesn't just involve him, but involves both of them as like a pastor and a pastor's wife, do you think that would be grounds at least for them to be suspended from ministry as they kind of like work through it? Because obviously if they see that Pastor Trumbo is like vindicated and he's right in doing it, then obviously everything just kind of goes wherever. But like if they find that he's wrong, do you think that they should open that up to, well, what has the wife been doing, and what does their ministry look like?
Can we open to 1 Timothy 3 just a second, Kenzie? Because let's take a look at that list of qualifications and let's find, is there one or two or three that would be legitimate contributors to this discussion? Go ahead, Kenzie, while we're opening.
And kind of that idea that Jade was talking about is if they do go down a path where they find his action, like with the church, find his actions and to take him out of his leadership role. I think as I kind of looking at the idea that she was doing this out of spite and that led up to where they are right now. I think that there's a lot of things that they need to step back from to figure this out. For one, because she did kind of provoke this to go in this extreme way, and they've now ended up there. But there's a lot of things they need to fix before they come back to ministry. That's where.
Okay. Well, good comment. Look at this list. Tell me which ones are we dealing with here?
above reproach.
Okay, now some would say that's kind of a general blanket statement and everything else kind of defines that. So, because that is a tough one, it's very broad.
No sin.
Well, no, or we could say no undealt with sin, no outstanding debts. Yeah. Look at right after husband and one wife. What's the next one?
Temperate.
Which means?
Translation I have says sober-minded.
Yeah. Some say self-controlled, temperate is the idea of self. Some would say he lost his control here. Although we had pastors playing soccer together in Brazil that would lose their cool on the soccer court once in a while. I don't remember anybody saying, "You're done." Not just with the game, but with ministry. Yeah. But any of the others come to your mind here, looking at this list?
What respectable
Yeah. Respectable.
and gentle, peaceable.
Yeah, not violent.
So, okay, would you guys admit that all of these qualifications can be considered in degrees? Because there's nobody that measures up to these perfectly, right? So who is it in the final analysis that decides whether the respectability, for example, line has been crossed, or whether the temperate line has been crossed? Who has that obligation?
People around him.
Okay, yes, these commands were given to
Church.
the church, yeah. So yeah, you're right. People, I would say in specific the church. Okay, the community may have an opinion, but the church is the one that has the responsibility to analyze these qualifications, right? Paul gave them to the church through Timothy. Okay, Timothy is the recipient of the letter, but it's intended for the churches.
So, do you think that it should go to the actual church members of the church that he's shepherding to make that decision?
Where's this at again?
Uh,
What country is this again?
it just says South Pacific Isles.
We're talking probably about a very collectivistic society.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that to try to deal with it member by member is probably not going to work because they're used to making consensus-oriented decisions, group decisions.
Yeah. Well, I just mean because currently the people making the decision on it is a pastoral disciplinary committee. So
Right.
obviously not people part of this church.
What is the guideline that Paul gives a specific guideline in chapter 5 regarding the denunciation of an elder? Do you remember what it is? There's a qualification there. Look at 1 Timothy 5. Very specific.
Do not rebuke an older man. Is that what you're talking about?
Keep going.
So encourage him as you would a father, younger men.
I'm sorry, what verse are you in there?
I was just looking at the first one. I didn't know if that's what you were talking
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, drop down to 19.
about. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses.
That actually has roots in the Old Testament. The law required 2 or 3 witnesses. So, in other words, one person's, and his wife would not have the ability, according to this passage, to testify alone against him, resulting in his dismissal, even his wife.
Well, because right after it happened, she went to the missionary couple.
Right?
So that would be
Are they witnesses, though?
what actually happened.
Yeah.
Well, she'd be bruised up.
Yeah.
She was bruised up.
Okay, yeah,
They could be a witness of her.
right. And it doesn't sound like the pastor's trying to weasel out of it and say, I didn't do that. It doesn't.
No, he was just straight up like, yeah, this is what we do.
Okay.
So it's not.
Yeah. Interesting. So the church is going to make the ultimate decision, right? These qualifications are entrusted to the church. And if he says a man has to rule his house well, what does that mean? What if he has one child out of 4 that walks away from the Lord? Does that mean he was a bad father? Well, maybe not. Who decides that? The church.
Well, so in this case, will the disciplinary committee just give a recommendation on what they should do, or are they actually going to pass judgment?
That there's probably some room for flexibility in terms of church leadership here in this case, because the Bible isn't that stringently specific about church polity. I think the principle of congregational government is present, but how how much you can specify. I think there's some room for creativity here, individuality in the churches. What is the attitude of the church? Do we have any hints to that here?
The older people, they think that he's right in doing so, that she had it coming to her, because I believe that there were people, the older people were obviously people that grew up in that culture, and like that was just how it was for them. And then you have people that have grown up like inside of the church, just like from the church up, and they think it's wrong, and almost to the point they said that it wasn't the way that it said it was that they weren't like 100%, but that they had the feeling that the pastor may have sinned.
So why do you suppose that there's that difference of opinion between the older folks and the members that grew up in the church? There's a definite disagreement of opinion.
It's just interesting because, like, obviously both of those groups are still living in that culture, like living in that context, like on those islands. So
It does talk about two different cultures, though. Like the Highlander culture is more prone to like the wife beating, whereas the coastal people were used to treating their wives with more equality. And so.
Yeah, interesting. So now you have really, in a sense, you have two different cultures in this church, right?
Yeah.
The Highlanders and the coastal people, and they have a different way of looking at this. So, what do you do? That's what he's trying to figure out. Can you feel some of his pain? And he's a missionary, right? So he's a third culture coming in. Now you have two disagreeing cultures, then you got a Western culture coming in besides. You have three cultural perspectives dealing with this.
I can see why he just immediately went to the committee.
Yeah, and that was the right thing to do. For him to impose a Western idea or something like that, you know.
I just wonder if in a culture like that, if like the police were like involved or anything like that, if he would actually be arrested for it.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Like if there's actual laws against it, or is it kind of?
I would guess that there aren't, just like in the case of the Indian police beating people who don't have their masks on. Totally acceptable. I'm guessing that that's probably the case here too. This will not become a legal issue.
They're driving down the road by themselves and they're getting beat for not having a mask on.
Well, you have to understand Indian roads, there are people going all different directions and not flying along fast. Okay, they're going between animals and people. And so, you know, the police, they're coming up on a motorcycle next to them and whipping them on their motorcycles.
I
Yeah.
ridicule for people. after that.
But it's considered corrective and appropriate in the Indian culture.
Do they give him a mask to wear?
They give it-
I don't think, I didn't see any police officers giving them a mask. And these guys, and understand, most of these guys riding their motorbikes were barebacked, no shirts on. So they're getting beat right on their skin.
They're spreading germs from hitting different people.
Oh,
with
yeah. This is tough. This is why we do this, by the way. This is the purpose for this class. There are some, I mean, there are people in our society that would look at us for spanking our kids as going over the line. It's one thing to exhort them, to talk to them, to reason with them, but to beat them, that's what they would call it, is child abuse. It's inhumane, it's animalistic, barbaric, all kinds of words come out. And that's kind of the situation we're dealing with here, looking at this from, and the verses you gave are very good, excellent verses. Okay. Let's keep talking. Or are you completely confused now?
I just feel like I feel like it all hinges on whether or not Pastor Trumbo actually recognizes that what he's doing is wrong.
Yeah.
So is everybody assuming that he's wrong then? Or is everybody in agreement that what he did was wrong?
Yes.
Is anybody not there? Just checking. Is anybody not convinced that he was wrong for beating his wife physically?
No, he was right.
Somebody could make the argument that like, oh, it's just the culture there. But, you know, there is a culture on that island that doesn't accept it either.
Mhm.
Right,
So there are natives that say, no, that's wrong.
right.
So it's not merely a like,
Not a given.
it's not a given that, you know, it's just how people live. Like there is a adverse opinion to it in that place already.
Okay. Now they might argue, well, these are the new believers. No, it doesn't say that.
The new believers don't have any opinion.
Right, they're confused. Right,
They're
yeah.
just like, what's going on?
They're with us. Yeah. Now, in a culture like that, which group is going to tend to carry the most weight in the decision?
The older.
The older ones. But they're also from the Highlands, right? I think, Amy, that's what you were pointing out. That's the group that came from the Highlands.
So that's why I think it really hinges on Pastor Trombo saying that he was wrong. Because he's a pastor, they'll recognize that his leadership and stuff like that, it comes from him directly.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, I don't think they're going to change.
Now, you're actually hearkening to another biblical principle here that may not be listed specifically in the qualifications, but what's another principle that he needs to observe as it relates to dealing with these two groups?
Like he's like a role model,
Yeah,
as an example.
yeah, he's a role model. He needs to promote the unity of the church. Nobody's going to leave the church if they decide to deal. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some might. Does Romans 14 leak into this discussion at all? I think it does. To some degree, Romans 14 principle does. He may offend somebody no matter what he decides or what the community decides.
Yeah.
But probably, which decision is going to bring the greatest chance of unity and harmony in the church?
Probably that he was wrong.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
Is that where you are on it?
Yeah, I feel like if he's the one that admits that it's sin and he can reconcile with his wife, because I think ultimately what's really going to show a lot of maturity in him is if him and his wife can reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's one thing to just be like, oh, I'm right, my wife's wrong. Like that might make a few people happy, specifically the people that hated his wife. But I think ultimately a pastor that can reconcile with his wife and be unified with his wife shows a lot more maturity.
I don't know if any of you have ever been in a church where the husband, the pastor, and the wife are at odds. But if you ever have, it's not pretty. And normally in a church in that situation, just simply cannot go forward until that's resolved. Question, of course, they're dealing with is how is it? Is it his responsibility to do that, or is it hers to repent so yeah. Other comments that come to your mind that might help us? We know what he beat her with? Nothing's ever said about that, is there?
No,
Was it a wet noodle or was it a baseball bat?
I would
Well, she was bruised, right?
probably just with his hands, I'd imagine, maybe with a belt. I wouldn't, because she apparently was able to go immediately to the missionary's house after. So
It doesn't say specifically that there were bruises on her body, right?
it just said she was bruised.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, you can do it with your hand, but still that's excessive.
It kind of feels to me like this might have been the first time that she's actually been beaten, though, because, like, I guess it was to the point where she was like, I need to like go to like the missionaries and talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
She'd been working for them too, so she was probably, to my understanding, she probably might have been part of that same group
Right.
that really didn't think of beating as like a normal custom.
I do think, this goes back to something said earlier, I do think it's dangerous to assume that a husband can treat his wife in the same way when it comes to his leadership as he would treat his children. To say, well, he can beat his children with a rod, Proverbs, so why can't he, he's the head of the home. Okay, there is a clear distinction between the husband-wife relationship and the husband and father-son relationship. And so simply to assume that because he can beat a son into submission, he can beat a wife into submission, I think is to misunderstand the uniqueness of those two relationships. That's one of the things that this church can teach its people. what's the difference between a husband exercising authority over his wife and a father exercising authority over his son or daughter? Very, very different relationship. And I get the impression he doesn't really see that those lines are blurred.
Do you know how, because this is obviously something that happens in the Pacific and in like Africa, do you know how they kind of deal with a cultural issue like this? Do they just blatantly say, oh, you're wrong, like you need to change? Or how do they?
It's like we deal with any tough issues. You know, it takes time. Sometimes it's a generational thing. There are, for instance, we talked about polygamy before. There are cases in Africa where no one's going to be qualified to pastor that church from the current generation because they're all polygamists. So that's where patience and, you know, being there for the long haul is really, really important in this kind of ministry. If you're not, then, you know, you're only prolonging the maturing of the church. This pastor the missionary definitely did the right thing by going to a committee. So he's not coming across as he's imposing his culture on them. He has an ally here in the new members who've grown up in that church. Yeah. This reminds you of all the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Remember that when that council was over, both groups walked out with a responsibility. The Jews walked out with a responsibility, not insisting that the Gentiles become Jews. The Gentiles also walked out with responsibility to avoid certain things that would be an offense to Jews that they meet in society. So whatever decision is made here, and I tend to agree with you guys, I think there needs to be some sort of action to prevent this from happening. Whether he's removed from the pastor or not, you know, I personally don't know that there's enough information here, enough context to say that. I guess I would say not necessarily, if he's willing to come to grips with that.
I mean, it said that his church was flourishing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like he had bad pastoral work going on or anything.
Right. Yeah. That's difficult. If he's simply unwilling to, you know, he may end up dividing the church anyway. And of course, that's a practical thing. Remember, we're always dealing with the theological and the practical, and the theological always has to take precedence. Start there, and what works comes after. Can't be pragmatic. So, all in favor of exhorting the pastor and pointing out that he was wrong?
Yes.
We're going to do this democratically or by consensus? Yeah. So, you know, what you think about removing him from the pastor or not, you know, I personally would avoid taking it that far based on the limited knowledge that I have here. Say, give him a chance to recognize that, be teachable. A pastor needs to be teachable, right? In fact, the qualification is apt to teach. The Greek doesn't resolve it for us. It could mean that he has to be a teacher, or it could mean that he is teachable. Both of those are possible. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. So if he's truly a man of God and he's sensitive to the Lord and to his sheep, to his people, I think he would come to a place where he says, you know, I need to make some change in this area. I want to promote the unity of the body. I see there are two different vantage points. There are ways that I can lead my home without beating my wife. Yeah. And if he has that heart, that attitude, I think there's a lot of hope for his continued ministry. If he digs his heels in and says, you're not going to tell me what to do, I think we have a problem. Yeah. All right, good. Well, thanks. You picked a tough one, man. That was a tough one, but
I didn't think it would be as complex as that, to be honest, but
because we're dealing with degrees, you know, the difference between verbal, non-physical, and physical, and just a lot of factors have to be considered. Okay, who's on for next time? Pardon?
That'd be me.
You're on. Do you remember which one it is?
When a woman should be a man.
When a woman should be a man. And remember, this is not a transgender issue. Okay, this is an authority issue we're dealing with. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Thanks for joining us class today. Glad you guys here.